Good morning, everybody. Just wanted to take a little bit of time, and we're going to talk about Chapter 10 in our Emergency and Disaster Planning for Homeland Security and Civil Disorder. Topic's very appropriate right now, like scarily so. Um, and so I wanted to spend just a little bit of time going over that unit and some of the things in there. And it all relates to planning and working the plan and making sure that our plan is going to work with some pre-planning and some pre-planning options. Um, your book gives a little history about Homeland Security, and we all know that it was something, a department that came into play or came into be um, after 9/11. Some people may refer to it previously as civil defense. And if you really know your fire service history, you'll know that a lot of fire departments were started out of civil defense. But Homeland Security is a phrase that's been coined, and we hear it so much now that it is a department, but it is certainly something that has been around for a while. Um, your book speaks to a lot of different types of situations, and again, this book, even though it is not that old, it's 10 years old. Um, a lot of the things either they've come true or there's a lot of other types of incidents that have occurred that we might never have thought about. Um, they provide a list, and this is some questions were asked of people of what they thought were the most likely things to happen, the possible threats that the U.S. might receive, and this was done in 2006. 2006, sorry. Um, a large number of illegal immigrants come into the country. That was 55%, and we know that that's true. So this is, again, 10 years old. A significant natural disaster destroys large areas of a major city. I don't think we've really seen, well, Katrina, of course, was part of that. Terrorists launch a number of attacks against airplanes. I don't. It's kind of like we think airplanes are the only type of public transportation now, um, but we've been pretty good about that since 9/11. So we're a little better with there. The country is attacked with biological weapons, major riots by groups within the country. Um, we've been seeing a lot of that. Um, Not really riots. I don't want to, and I don't want to get real political about it, but a lot of protest and a lot of terrorist attacks um, on our law enforcement personnel. Um, we haven't seen any nuclear attacks, which about 14% of the people thought that that was going to happen. A lot of different things can happen. The number three there, where it discusses major riots by groups within this country. Um, a lot of that was seen back in the 60s and 70s with a lot of different groups that existed at the time, and their ideas were a little bit different. They were more interested in converting people to their way of thinking than killing people. And then the terrorists of today, of course, Timothy McVeigh was probably the most famous in in my knowledge anyway, or my life of um, the internal terrorist, I'll call them, when he drove that truck of fertilizer up in front of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Um, so it can be, internal terrorist groups can be a lot of different things. Domestic terror groups is what they call them. Militant groups to conservatives. I think that even you look at attacks on Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Um, that could be seen as a terrorist attack and what they had amassed in their homes. So um, it's not something that we should take lightly. We like to think that terrorism comes from abroad, and we have seen, of course, that. Um, but sometimes we're our own worst enemies. And I hope that our country will settle down a little bit in the days of all of the shootings and protests. Too many people have died already. It's time for it to stop, and that's my editorial, and I'll leave it at that. Some of the imported threats that we might see, there's a lot of different terrorist organizations that do operate within the United States. When the book was written, Al Qaeda was the biggest one. I think ISIS, and I'm not politically um, knowledgeable, I guess, enough about it to know how these things all fit together. But I do know that ISIS is one of the biggest threats, and we've seen a lot of attacks overseas. Just this past week, the truck that drove into the crowd on Bastille Day in Nice, France. So there's a lot of different sources that can pose threats to the security um, of the United States. We have a lot of people, we have a lot of wealth, we have a lot of infrastructure that people want to damage that, and so we have to make sure that, we are protected from those things. Um, Again, Al Qaeda was one that was discussed a lot in the book, um, and I think there's others out there now that are even more prevalent than that. When we talk about civil disturbances, there's some notable ones. And it's interesting that, and I don't know what it says about our society or our country, the two that are given as examples in the textbook both revolved around law enforcement. And so, kind of interesting there when we look at those. One was in Cincinnati, and then one was, of course, in Los Angeles. Um, at looking at why we have civil disturbance, a group feels oppressed or is oppressed. I don't want to minimize that. Um, these things don't just pop up, and I think that's kind of the lesson that I'm feeling this morning. In that, when we look and I'll talk about them in just a second, the Cincinnati um, riots and the ones in Los Angeles, that both involved law enforcement and African American populations. Um, there's a theme there, and I don't know what that means. I do know that it needs to be prepared, and that hindsight is 2020, and that communities have looked back where they could see these feelings escalating, and that's what we have to look at and in our part of our prevention process. But we also have to plan for those. Cincinnati was in 2001, so it was the same year as the terrorist attacks. It was in April of 2001, and again, it related to police officers and the deaths of several African American members of the community. The book states that black males, that the Cincinnati police had altercations with black males that resulted in the death of 15 black males during the 6 previous years, and that there had been no deaths of white civilians. So, or white males. So I guess I need to be more specific about that. Again, the leaders looked back and see that this riot that took place in April of 2001 in Cincinnati could have been predicted and maybe stopped, who knows, or prevented. But when we look at it from a response standpoint, of course, law enforcement are front runners. Bless them. They are the ones that get out there between the law enforcement and whether it's a militia, such as the National Guard or whoever's called out. But fire department, EMS are going to be in there as well. And it's also an emergency management problem in that this is a disaster. It can be a disaster, and we have to be prepared for it. So the Cincinnati fire chief, they organized what they called task force, and he collected the people up, his personnel at specific stations within each district, and they ran as a task force. And I think that included an engine, a ladder, um, an ambulance, a patrol car, and a command vehicle if one was available. So they ran as a group, and that is important. That's an important piece of that, of making sure that we do have police officer protection, and that we are able to do our jobs. Is That's important as well. For years afterwards, Cincinnati still had its problems and probably still does today. They did focus on some police community relations. Um, so hopefully it is better there. But they had planned for this. They had this task force set up for their emergency response. 1992 was the Los Angeles riots, and those of us that remember that are old enough to remember that. The Rodney King riot. Again, I think it's so interesting that this was the events of what happened to Rodney King were filmed by an amateur. I just think today, um, with cell phones and videos, how much of that we see today, and I don't know how I feel about that. I think there's places where you shouldn't have cell phones, but that's my personal opinion. Again, I said I wasn't going there. So again, this a lot of looting and vandalism and arson, and that in many ways that's the fire department's response. We're not supposed to. We're not there to render peace in this situation. We are there to respond to fires and other types of serious incidents. Those of us that run EMS are there to respond and treat the injuries. The police are there to kind of calm the waters, if you will, or law enforcement. And so we have to recognize what our response is. Many times it's recommended that the fire department stage outside of these areas, but and this happened in Los Angeles, and after a while, the fires just became overwhelming, and they had to do something. They had to enter into that. So we're not immune in this country to um, internal strife. And it pains me to talk about this because of what is going on today, what happened this weekend in Baton Rouge, um, and where it is all going. But at least I hope that um, fire department leaders around the country are taking a look at that emergency disaster plan and making sure that they have made provisions. It's one of those things where you never really make provisions for an event that where an airplane flies into a building. Not something we think about a lot, and this is not something that we really want to think about either. But we have to be prepared for it. Some of the things that are recommended. Of course, we all know that after 9/11, security was just heightened. You couldn't go anywhere, do anything. That all of a sudden the security at the airport that had been local was replaced by TSA, and all of a sudden, it was awful to try to get through lines in the airport. The old plastic and duct tape that they told you to put over your windows in case of a chemical attack. Um, Strangely reminiscent of the 50s and 60s when um, you would have um, drills and you get under your desk at school for bombs, knowing that that's really not going to help anything, and it's really not going to work very well at all. So, people went out and bought security devices, and your book points out some pretty great points that people have bought all these cameras and monitors and all this stuff, but they're only good if you have somebody monitoring them, a person watching all of those cameras, etc. Installing metal detectors or screening devices when you don't really know what a bomb looks like. And we know now that it can look like anything. And it can be a shoe. It can be in your shampoo. It can be anything. So we were alerted as citizens to look for suspicious behavior. And whatever that is I've learned that wherever you live, that suspicious behavior takes on different meanings of what is suspicious or not suspicious. But we do have to be proactive. And one of the things that your book points out when we're looking at pre-incident awareness is to look at awareness, security assessment, security enhancement as a means of pre-incident type of security measures that we can take. Awareness, a situational awareness. And we have been taught that for a while now, not just when you're on a fire scene, but I think it becomes more important when we're talking about EMS calls, other types of calls that you enter into. So that because many times you can walk into a setup, as happened to our friends in Gwinnett County not too terribly long ago on a medical call. In Valdosta, a police officer was recently shot because someone called 911. So we have to have that situational awareness about us and making sure that we observe everything. And if it doesn't feel right, trust your gut. But also preparing for those things. If somebody had reported that Timothy McVeigh had apparently he was due discounts because of the amount of fertilizer he had bought, and he didn't want them. He knew he wasn't going, that it wasn't going to be needed, and so different things that I think we hate to report suspicious things, but that's how people are caught, and that's how emergencies are stopped. So making sure that we are aware of our surroundings, and even when we go into homes that where it's a legitimate call, that we are looking around and checking out. The second key that can lead to successful security preparation is that assessment piece. Making sure that we do have hardened facilities, such for our EOC and our communications, even our fire stations. The doors had to come down on the fire stations. And I always hated to see that it should have been an open place, a safe place. And once again, we found ourselves having to lock our doors. It could be that some kind of attack or compromise might happen there. Of course, the infrastructure, food, water, contamination, power generation sites, those kinds of things need to be protected and guarded and taken care of, and make sure that they are secured. And it's part of our assessment of what can happen in these particular situations. So it should focus on the overall security precautions that are in place, identification checks, closed circuit televisions that are monitored, and metal detectors. Those kinds of things, certainly. And then the third kind of preparation is our security enhancement. To have some kind of effective security preparation is important. There's got to be awareness of the kind of threat that we could receive. Again, after 9/11, there was all these screenings that happened at the airport, but nobody thought about buses or trains or other kinds of public transportation. It was all of a sudden because they used airplanes. That's what we needed. But that may not necessarily be the case next time. So making sure that we try to look at those things is very important. Monitoring systems, all of that are important as well. Things that your book mentions post-incident preparations that we can go ahead and make as far as security is concerned. When the event is over, a lot of times everything kind of goes back to normal. And terrorists know that we let our guard down, we become the good citizens that we are, and the terrorists know that we let our guard down. And so, when you're responding to those routine calls, again, you find yourself in the middle of something that's really not so routine anymore. So a lot of things have to happen. You have to think about too some of the potential problems for the fire department at civil disturbances is that we become a target. If you've watched any of the video from Littleton, Colorado, where fire trucks were used as shields, um, that was scary. That was scary. Not exactly what we signed up for. I guess that's one of those situations where you get the rookie to drive the truck. No, and I'm just kidding about that. But the fire department can be a target. Many of us have complained about wearing Nomex uniforms, navy blue, that look just like police officers, and people that think are police officers. And so we are not immune to all of that. When we're operating in hostile environments, of course, some preparation things, if you have equipment mounted on the outside of your trucks, need to secure it somehow because it's subject to theft. Leaving that truck parked there, it could be tampered with. Think about, in riot situations where there's fires, hydrants may be tampered with. When I was coming along 100 years ago in my recruit training, when you turned on the hydrant, you left the hydrant wrench on top of it so that you knew where it was when it came time to turn the water off. Well, now I don't know if that is still a common practice, but it's there so that the water can be turned off when maybe you don't want it to be turned off by someone that's a part of a crowd. So some things like that we may have to think about and change those kinds of things. Deploying as a task force, we may not have the luxury of having that intercompany, ladder company, ambulance, and police as a group, but certainly making sure that law enforcement is accompanying coming with us, or that at least we go as a group. So that if nothing else, there's somebody there to watch the periphery of the scene while others are rendering care or aid or whatever needs to be done. This is where your area command may come into play. I can see that in Cincinnati, in a large town like that, as they are looking around the different areas. That would be very important, and they can stay in their district, but they also have to coordinate. And also the EOC. Activating your EOC, routing calls through the EOC, because there's going to be more calls than you can handle. Having a plan in place where your EOC and your dispatch center are talking, communicating, whether that means that they're in the same room or they're communicating in another way, so that those in the EOC can help maybe triage, if you will, some of those calls to make sure that the closest units are taking those calls, and also that the more serious ones are being dealt with. So when we think about, a lot has come up about firefighters being armed and carrying guns, and I don't know how I feel about that. We've always been the ones that did it, and the good guys, but I also understand it. And so if you can work with your police departments or your law enforcement in your area to have a plan together, that's important too. Having a gun is not necessarily always the right thing. It might get you in more trouble. I don't know. Again, that's a personal opinion, and I'm trying to stay out of those. Bombings are one of the most common things that we think about. Some things to think about when we're planning for, of course, is the level of response for that type of a situation. That first arriving company gets there, they tend to be overwhelmed. And so, again, trying to keep that, going into that command mode, doing that 360 if you can of the scene so that you know what you're dealing with, so that you get the proper resources. Thinking about building collapse is another important aspect of that. Making sure that we have the right equipment on scene to deal with the situation. Another problem that we all know about is the secondary device. We saw those a lot a long time ago. I was trying to think of the year and I can't come up with it. But in the abortion clinic bombings where there are secondary devices, and those are aimed at the responders. That's all that it was aimed at. So treatment and triage areas have to be designated. Your medical team has to be that mass casualty group needs to be summoned depending upon the target of this, the target of that was hit, the occupancy of that. Your hospitals put on high alert. Controlling utilities is another aspect of it as well. Is making and certainly making sure that it is a safe scene for everyone. Again, the secondary device, always being on the lookout of that, getting your bomb sniffing dogs there early if possible, so that they can secure the scene for you. Um, Coordination is real important. And we have to let we as firefighters, the fire people need to focus on um, that operation, that piece of it, the fire and rescue problem, and let EMS concentrate on the care, the medical care for the survivors and the injured. And so for some of us that are both, sometimes it gets confusing, I guess. But just remember what your assignment is. If you've been assigned to operations, then you're going to do fire operations. If you've been assigned to EMS operations, you're going to do EMS. And that's where you just have to focus. No freelancing or overlapping. Law enforcement's going to take care of evacuating survivors and preserving evidence. And of course, they want to talk to people to see what they can find out about. So these types of situations, I hope that, I hope that none of us ever encounter this type of situation where it is a terrorist threat in our own communities. But I also know that planning for them, drilling for that to happen, again, you have to work together with your law enforcement, with your EMS, the urban search and rescue teams that we now have in Georgia, the GSAR teams. That's real important to work with them to know what kind of resources they can offer. You may not have a team in your department, but I think a lot of departments are having those now. That's where your mutual aid and automatic aid agreements will come into play. So just remember that when we're looking at planning for this type of an incident, we want to look at security awareness, security assessment, security enhancement. We want to make sure that we have our plan and that it's up to date. That terrorists aren't always not from this country. That we can be, as I said, our own worst enemy. Just because you live in a small town doesn't mean that you're immune either. That doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it, because it happens. It happens everywhere. It can happen anywhere, especially with the domestic terrorism. I think that we grow a lot of that. I would just encourage you, go ahead and look through this chapter and familiarize yourself. I hate that this is kind of brief and disjointed a little bit, but I did want to make sure that we covered this unit. I'm going to try to get some information up on the next chapter, which is on terrorism, so that, again, we will be prepared for that, because I think those are things that, while they may not be what is most likely to occur in our area, that they're first and foremost in a lot of people's minds. And we as responders have to do our best to be prepared for those, and so that we can protect the citizens that we serve. So check out your chapter, just kind of look through it, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.